This is a conversation with Rory Cormac, a professor at the University of Nottingham, whose professional expertise is in a very particular subject of so-called covert action, subversive actions that states carry out against their opponents in secrecy and while denying their own involvement. Or in other words, the shadiest stuff that spies from nations all around the world can do, from overthrowing foreign governments, arming proxy groups, and carrying out sabotage and assassinations. If you're interested in geopolitics, this probably naturally comes as a fascinating subject. And so we talk about how various nations approach and engage in this area. From the US current effort to overthrow Maduro's regime in Venezuela and its rich history of overthrowing foreign regimes, the Russian wave of covert action in Europe, and what European countries like the UK and France covertly do or not do themselves. How does China approach this, and why does it seem to stay under the radar? Or why, if covert action is meant to be secret, we seem to read about it all the time in mainstream news nowadays. And much more. Now, just a quick clarification. This episode was recorded shortly before the United States operation against Venezuela, which obviously changed the context of what we talked about a little bit. But nevertheless, I think that the part of the episode where we talk about Venezuela is still just as relevant and interesting, and perhaps even more now that we know what actually followed after. This podcast and interviews like this can exist only thanks to its supporters on Patreon and Substack, to whom I'm deeply grateful, and who get a bunch of perks in return for their support, including the full ad-free version of this and other episodes, and additional bonus content. And if you want to get even more geopolitical analysis, I also write a newsletter. You can find the link in the description. And now, enjoy the conversation. So welcome to the podcast.
Thanks very much for having me.
So I want to talk about your topic of your academic research and your focus of your career, which is the extremely interesting, fascinating topic of intelligence, but most importantly of specifically covert action, which is the kind of the shadiest stuff that governments and states tend to have and employ is their part of their tool package. And I think it's extremely interesting. And maybe to start with, I'd be curious to hear first, how do you get into focusing on something like that? And second, how difficult it is for a researcher to research a topic that, by definition, I imagine, there's probably not that much public information about, and that the actors that you're researching are probably incentivized to make to give out as little public information as possible.
Well, I got into it because, to be perfectly honest, it's incredibly interesting, and just great fun to research is the wrong word, because some of it's a very serious topic. But it's the intellectual challenge. From leading on to the second part of your question is just really stimulating. I think it's very, very interesting. I think it's very important, and I think it's really significant in international relations. And I got into it. I was doing my PhD on intelligence assessment, and I'll be honest, it was quite dull. And then there was one chapter about how the people doing intelligence assessments were also involved in overseeing covert operations, as British covert operations in Yemen in the 1960s. And I was doing this about 15 years ago. I remember thinking, this is just super interesting, looking at how and why the state was choosing to engage in covert operations, where the limits were, how they came up with those limits, how they judged success, some of the really quite brutal assessments of the conditions under which they choose parties to support. Things like, are these rebel tribes, as it then was, willing to fight and die for their cause, that kind of thing. I remember seeing all this written in black and white and thinking, wow, this is really, really interesting. And it just snowballed a bit from there. And this was about 15 years ago. And of course, particularly since Russia's annexation of Crimea in 2014, and then Putin and interference in the American elections in 2016, this has become a topic which has become increasingly salient within the world, within universities, policymakers, commentators, and it's just kind of growing from there. But it is a topic, as you say, which is difficult to study, but I think in a good way. It's difficult in a way people don't often think. So the first challenge, as you correctly allude to, is secrecy. And states are naturally secretive when around this kind of material. So I've always generally taken a more historical approach. And this leads to certain biases. So, for example, the United States, with whom many people associate Cold War covert actions, the classic things which you and your listeners will be familiar with. The United States, to be fair to them, one, writes down their definitions of covert action, publicly available within their legal framework, and two, acknowledges and declassifies various records when it comes to covert action, which helps historians. Now, obviously, we need to look at those with a slightly critical lens, but there is some material out there. Other places, other countries, don't declassify anything, and I can pick on my home country of the United Kingdom here, where there's very, very little, and MI6 was only officially existed in 1994 and doesn't declassify any material. So question one is a secrecy, but even when you get past that, and there is enough out there, I think, to be credible, rigorous research, or I'd like to think so anyway. Once you get past that, there's the challenge, a more intellectual challenge of working out how do we differentiate covert action from other things, like if there's electoral interference, if there is a coup or a regime change or something, how do we know how much of that is the external hidden hand interfering and how much of it is internal things? And that dynamic is fascinating because covert action, by its very nature, nudges history along. It tries to find a pre-existing group, party, faction, narrative, and what it does then, the state, it tries to amplify that and grow it. It doesn't necessarily create these things from scratch. So there's usually a pre-existing force internal to the state, which the external instigator wants to promote. And so then the challenge for the scholar and the policymaker and the commentariat is to work out, well, how much of this is covert action? How much of this is America or Russia or China or whoever influencing and interfering? And how much of it was going to happen anyway? And there's some really interesting, I think, intellectual challenges with very, very real policy consequences underpinning some of those big questions.
Yeah. Well, and I imagine, or it feels that there's also a tendency, I think, globally to kind of see sometimes covert action of other states almost behind everything, whether, that's United States or Russia for other people.
I completely agree, and it's a really, really tricky balance when this is a genuine issue in international relations. We know that many states, but to varying degrees of intensity, engage in what the Americans might call covert action, what the rest of us might call, I don't know, coercive interference or unacknowledged coercive interference in the affairs of others. We need to be aware of it. We need to, when it's targeted against Western states need to be aware and push back against it and defend against it and build resilience and all that kind of thing, which we see in various national security strategies all the time. But at the same time, we need to get that balance right, whereby we don't end up assuming that, say, Russia, because Russia's in the news a lot at the moment for good reason, is behind every single piece of disinformation or every single fire on a railway network across Europe, because that risks ending up playing into Putin's hands, whereby if we assume that Russia is behind every lie in the Western press, and then there's a risk that, and if we assume that Russia aims to sow cynicism amongst Western European and North American readers and create distrust in institutions and in so-called, I hate that phrase, mainstream media, then if we end up assuming that everything's a lie, then that ends up inadvertently doing Putin's work for him. And I think the same goes for sabotage, which is, again, a big deal, particularly on the European continent at the moment. And we need to take it very, very seriously. Don't get me wrong. This is a significant issue. At the same time, if we think that if we assume that Putin behind everything, it suddenly makes Russian capabilities look way better than they actually are. Makes Putin seem like this grand chess master playing four-dimensional chess or whatever. And it also does the kind of work for him, because if Russia, again, sake of argument, wants to disrupt and degrade, slow down Western European infrastructure, or raise costs, raise barriers towards logistical support for Ukraine or whatever it may be, if we end up assuming that there's Russian sabotage everywhere, we're going to add that red tape and that friction ourselves. So it's a very, very difficult balance to make, particularly when we're calling it out and attributing covert operations, sabotage, disinformation. And we see that many Western governments have taken on or prioritized public attribution in recent years, which I think is a good thing. But there is a cost. And the historian in me smiles, because none of this is new. And I was at a event, I won't say what it was, for practitioners, for policymakers last year, and they were talking about this exact issue. They were talking about how to attribute the dangers of overplaying some of this activity and doing the hostile actors' work for them, and it was almost word for word for files that I'd read from the Cold War, when they'd said we need to be careful around spotting disinformation. They used the word disinformation. This was early 1960s. We need to be careful about spotting disinformation, because if we end up seeing it everywhere, we end up doing, quote, the disinformer's job for him. And that was a discussion from the 1960s. And I just did some of these things. The technology changes massively, and it is still a very, very serious issue. And I don't want to give the impression I'm downplaying it, but how we expose it and deal with it, some of those big questions, the principles haven't changed for decades.
Just a quick break here. If you care about geopolitics, and I assume you do since you're listening to this, you might want to consider signing up to get my newsletter, Station Zero. Once every week or two, you'll get a free geopolitical analysis, a story, trend, or pattern of something that's really important, but that most people tend to miss. Like the one where I describe a chaotic oil war that's been going on between the US, Russia, and Saudi Arabia, that you basically never hear about, but that's quietly shaping geopolitics. If you want to sign up, just click the link in the description. And now, back to the conversation. I want to sort of go around the world and look at how different actors, state actors, are approaching covert action, how they're using it, and maybe compare them between each other a little bit. But before we get to that, one more thing I wanted to pick up on was that it does seem, sort of overall looking at your field of study of covert action, it does feel that, especially in recent years, especially since Russian invasion of Ukraine, but also since the war in Gaza started and Israel started being pretty active in its region, it seems that we're living in sort of a golden age of covert action, not just because there's so much of it happening, but because it's so front and center in mainstream media and front page news that it's covert, but we're hearing about it almost real time and all the time.
I find that paradox absolutely fascinating and important. And in fact, it's the reason why I wrote a book on this called How to Stage a Coup, which is kind of an overview of covert action, really. But the reason I mention that is because that is the exact driver why I wrote it. Was this fundamental question of, there's this thing that intelligence services, generally speaking, do that is covert. And it's got the word covert in the name, and it's generally seen as secretive. And yet, I wrote the book 2-3 years ago, it's on the news every single day. And to complicate things further, people seem to assume, even though it's on the news, it hasn't necessarily failed. Because the logical assumption would be, if this is supposed to be covert, if this is a secret thing, and yet it's on the news all the time and everyone's talking about it, then whoever was behind it has failed, because it is no longer secret. And yet the way that the media 2, 3, 4 years ago when I read the book was talking, they were talking up the impacts of particularly Russian interference in a whole range of places, Crimea and Ukraine, first and foremost among them. This is before the full-scale invasion, and trying to get to the heart of that was why I read the book. And then the reason why I got into this topic was, again, because it's not necessarily new. I remember when I was a student, we were learning about the famous American CIA covert action in Afghanistan in the 1980s, which was so unsecret. You had senators going along the Afghanistan-Pakistan border, almost with a nudge and a wink. And I remember thinking when I was a kid, I don't understand, how is this covert action? But the answer, I think, having looked at this quite a lot, is that we often overplay the secrecy in covert action. I think traditionally we assume that there's this binary of an action, or the sponsorship of the action is secret or it's not. And if it's not secret, if it's been blown, then it's failed. Whereas the reality is much, much more nuanced than that. And we see numerous states calibrating levels of secrecy in order to send a message. So I think there's an expectation that there are certain audiences. So for some audiences, it will be plausibly deniable. For other audiences, it will be implausibly deniable. And states calibrate that secrecy carefully, or at least try to, in order to send a particular messaging. So I think that to understand what's going on properly, we need to think of it not just as plausibly deniable attempts to shape stuff, but it's also about attempts to signal to adversaries and competitors and allies as well.
Yeah, and it seems that the signaling is becoming pretty important, or is even the main driver today. If I look at Russian, Ukrainian, Israeli covert operations, often the states never confirm that they have anything to do with it, or they might even formally deny it, but at the same time they're making it pretty obvious that they have been involved, and they're kind of, so yeah, it's a bit of a nudge and wink, and it seems that sometimes the signaling is the most important reason why they were doing it in the first place.
I completely agree, and there's numerous examples just recently, because maybe I'm misremembering, but didn't Netanyahu give Donald Trump recently a golden pager as a gift, which is quite clearly a nod and a wink to the exploding pagers that just happened to befall Hezbollah a few years back, and we see it time and time again, where this is the ambiguity is leveraged for messaging purposes, to whether it's to threaten, whether it's to show some resolve, whether it's to try and get someone back to the negotiating table, to bolster negotiating strategies, whatever it is. But the aim is often for the target to see a bit of this, and that's why I think we need to not be so hung up about the kind of the golden or the sacred cow of plausible deniability, because so often this type of activity is wildly implausible in its deniability, but that doesn't mean it's failed. So again, I prefer thinking of this as unacknowledged interference rather than covert action. And I think I would say that this is a battle I'll lose, because covert action is so widely ingrained in everyone's thinking. But fundamentally, it's an American bureaucratic and legal term denoting authorization procedures. And by trying to take that term and understand how loads of states engage in quote unquote covert action, we end up overplaying things like secrecy and plausible deniability, which in reality are much more nuanced.
So I think on that note, I think it would be good to start sort of the tour around the world of states engaged in covert action. And one particularly interesting example of the United States and their covert action is, I think, happening right now. And you have the paradox right there because, you wrote a book, How to Stage a Coup. I read the book. It's great. It's a quite a wide overview of the different tools and uses of covert action of various states in the past and now, and um, and clearly right now the United States is quite overtly trying to stage a coup or overthrow a regime in Venezuela. Donald Trump has publicly said that he has given carte blanche to the CIA to do covert operations in Venezuela in order to overthrow the Maduro's regime, and it feels quite almost nostalgic and old school that you have a United States trying to overthrow a dictator in Latin America. I feel like we've been there a few times in the 20th century. Um, how do you see that both as the paradox of you're having a covert action, but while it's happening, the United States president is announcing that there is covert action going on, and also looking at it as a historian of this. Um, how do you see it in the historical context of what the United States have been historically doing, especially in South America? And looking at that, how how often are those attempts to covertly overthrow a regime and replace it with something better, how often are they actually successful?
Well, on the first question around the unsecrecy of having covert action, where the president's telling everyone there's covert action. This is exactly what, a great example of what we were just talking about, isn't it? Where the there is a clear attempt to exploit or leverage ambiguity and to use covert action, the language of covert action, for public messaging. And it's not about deniable things that we will never hear about that end up leading to a regime change, like we might, and I'll come on to this in a minute, but we might have assumed would have happened back in the Cold War. This is front and center. Public tool of conflict, almost being widely discussed, and it raises this really big question about, well, how and why is it being used, and is it even covert action? If Donald Trump is openly talking about we're doing covert action, then it's no longer very covert. And my answer to that, and it's something that we thought quite a lot about, is it again shows that I think the narrow and slightly misleading nature of the words of the phrase covert action, because it is covert action, because covert action is an American legal and bureaucratic phase, and it is being authorized through those covert action channels, but it doesn't actually mean that it's secret, because he's talking about it. So what I think is a kind of consequence of that is we have this strange interference by the United States, which is clearly coercive, where what is the key factor, I think, is ambiguity. So basically, he said the US is doing things. The US is interfering. The US is doing things, and pointing to certain examples. But it also, so it sends a message, and also creates this narrative whereby if anything else happens in Venezuela, there's automatically going to be an assumption that the Americans were behind it. So, say, sake of argument, there's a blackout. There's a power cut, big blackout, or internet goes down, or something in across Venezuela, or in the government, or whatever. Because Donald Trump has said we are doing covert action, you can instantly imagine the Venezuelan people, and indeed more widely, assuming, rightly or wrongly, that the American intelligence services are behind anything now that goes wrong in Venezuela. And that's quite a powerful rhetorical tool, isn't it? Where suddenly they seem like they are quite omnipotent. So I think it's a nice example of this blurring of the overt covert, leveraging ambiguity in order to create a particular narrative and hostile atmosphere to get the policy goal that he ultimately wants. And whether that's so in the second part of the question about with my historian's hat on, how much of that is a change? I think that the brazenness of talking about covert action and bringing it out of the backstage into kind of open discussions of regime change, that is kind of new. With many aspects of the Trump presidency are pretty unprecedented, but there are a couple of interesting parallels. Where, for example, when Ronald Reagan was elected or re-elected, he was actively talking about the importance of resurrecting the CIA and he put on the campaign trail. He was talking about covert actions and how, not naming specific countries or whatever, but saying that the CIA needed to be more muscular and to take the fight to Moscow a little bit. So there are examples historically of presidents talking up covert action capabilities for whether it's for domestic political purposes to look tough at home, whether it's to send a message to adversaries, whatever it is. And I think there's a tendency to sometimes look back on the Cold War as this golden age of covert action, and indeed a golden age of secrecy and plausible deniability, that phrase that comes up time and time again. But some of these famous CIA backed regime changes, when you look at the reporting of it in real time from newspapers back in the 1950s, they were reporting a lot of this almost live, and the deniability was pretty shot to pieces. I mean, most famously, attempts in Cuba, where the Miami Herald was giving a running commentary on what was going on. But even supposed successes like in Guatemala in 1954, when there was the regime change against Arbet, the American hand in that was pretty implausibly denied at the time. So much so they then had to create a second operation to control the narrative around it, because everyone kind of knew the Americans were behind it and also were questioning Arbet's links to communism as a pretext for the regime change, which then leads on to the question of how successful was this kind of thing in the so-called golden age. And this goes back to what we were talking about right at the start. I mean, how do we judge success based on what sources, whose perspective, and all that kind of thing? But I think the bottom line is there are examples of these things being quote unquote success in the short term, where the person that the American leadership wanted to remove was removed. Arbet being a good example. Chedi Jagan in British Guyana in the 1960s being another good example. But then there's this ultimate question of, well, does success mean the operation ultimately succeeding, or does it mean the outcome in the mid to longer term being what the American leadership wanted? And there's growing research for a more quantitative background that isn't my field at all. So I take no credit for this or for understanding the statistics underpinning it. But it's saying that actually, if you look at the regime change, the Americans and the new regime they helped put in place are no closer. Then there's no better diplomatic relationship in the long term. So it's not actually worth necessarily the hit. Now, how you judge that is all contested. But we've got to make that short term, long term distinction. And the British Guyana is a good example actually, where there was a socialist leader. The Americans called him a Marxist, Chedi Jagan, in the 1960s, and was worried that he was increasingly closely aligned to Moscow, and so they helped remove him and rig the election to ensure his rival, a guy called Forbes Burnham, was in place. And on the surface, it looks like a very successful operation. Chedi Jagan was booted out, and Forbes Burnham became the new leader of Guyana. But within a fairly short time frame, Burnham ended up doing the exact same things that Jagan was doing, had overtures towards the Soviet Union, because there are still domestic and international structures and constraints which would push countries in certain directions for whatever reason. And it's too easy to think that you can just replace one person with someone else who on paper is more pro-American or pro-whoever, and then they will do your bidding, or they'll stay that way for long term because they're still subject to the same kind of constraints and pressures, whether it's financial or geopolitically or whatever it may be. So in the long term, that's a nice example, because in the long term, with Burnham, the leader of British Guyana, rather, whom the Americans helped put in place, was a pretty rubbish ally.
Yeah. Or you. I guess you could say that you can have the case of the regime overthrow in Iran in the 1950s that was successful for a while, but then essentially created conditions for the current theocratic regime in Iran to replace the American installed ruler, which ended up being even a lot worse for the U.S. than it ever was in the first place.
Yeah, and that's a classic example, and I like that one because we can certainly make that argument that the American instigated or supported regime change ended up creating the long term conditions. Now, there's a couple of questions which people then raise when one makes that argument. The first question is that the Iranian Revolution was a long time after the 1953 coup. So how much agency over long term can we give that coup in causing, quote unquote, the revolution? And then the other question that gets put to me when we make that argument is, well, was it worth it? Because, and you get into horrible counterfactuals of if, and it's a ridiculously big if, that prevented Iran from going communist or at the height of the Cold War, nuclear weapons, all that kind of thing. And that's what advocates of the regime change was saying 20, 30, 40, 50 years later, that, well, you don't know what we prevented from happening by doing that. And it was probably worth it, particularly as the decades went by and the direct causality between the coup and the revolution dwindles. And then the third question on this is, how much agency, this is slightly controversial, but how much agency did the Americans and the British have in instigating the coup against Mossadegh and putting their man in place? Because there is an argument to say, and this kind of goes back to what we were saying at the start about how we understand covert action, that by having that narrative, this was a CIA coup, you completely undermine internal agency in Iran. And there were people in Iran, swathes of society, who didn't like Mossadegh and were agitating to get rid of him. And ultimately, the coup itself was a bit of a botched job, and it took 3 days of improvisation. No one really knew what was going on. And so it's a difficult balancing act to acknowledge the role of the Americans and the Brits, it has to be said, whilst also saying that there were internal opposition forces to Mossadegh. So it just shows the complex nature of some of this activity, and how that then makes it really difficult to say, was a particular operation, was it a success? Because it depends on long term, short term, was it worth it? And how much involvement, how much impact did the covert action actually have on the outcome?
In your personal opinion, sort of the big picture of how effective do you think that covert regime changes are as a tool of statecraft? Because I had John Bolton on the podcast, and he's a former U.S. National Security Advisor, and he's a classic representative of the very hawkish U.S. policymaker who would probably prefer to overthrow regimes left and right. And then you have other people who are like very much against that. So where do you lean on that? If you were an advisor to the U.S. president, how much would you encourage him, or to any other president, or to the British Prime Minister? how much would you encourage them to use this tool, and how much would you be saying, actually, it never really works out the way we want it?
I think it rarely works out the way we want it. But my advice would be that there is a place for covert action in a state's its national toolkit. I think it's not inherently bad. I try to see it as a value neutral as a value neutral term. Many academics will say that any kind of covert action, any kind of knowledge interference is, particularly when conducted by democracies, is inherently wrong. I disagree with that. I think that there is a place for it in a toolkit. I think it needs to be used very, very carefully. And my advice would be, don't turn to this as a silver bullet. If you want to do something and over military force is impossible for whatever reason, diplomacy is not working for whatever reason, don't just phone up the CIA or phone up MI6 or DGSE or whoever it is and say, I've got this problem, go fix it. Because I think that's what ends up, and it is leading to lots of problems. I can see why they do it, because it's a very seductive option. You've got a bureaucracy at the end of a phone line who, in many countries, it has a history of engaging in covert operations, and it's trained, and there's authorization procedures. I can see why a prime minister or a president thinks, right, I've got this problem. I can't send in the troops, whether that is for financial reasons or whether it's because, particularly here over the last decade or so, the public is war weary after Iraq and the Afghanistan invasions. People don't want boots on the ground, and so there's an incentive there for the Prime Minister of the UK to say, okay, well, don't understand boots on the ground. Let's do something a little bit more discreet. I think there is a role for that discreet option, but it can't just be because all else fails. It can't just be as a last resort or a silver bullet to go and fix some difficult problem. So my advice would be, think carefully about what it can and can't achieve. Think carefully about calibrating it alongside open tools. I think one of the myths or misunderstandings around covert action is that it's always this third option between war and peace, or between diplomacy and armed force. Between diplomacy and armed force. When actually, to be successful, it complements or supplements diplomacy and armed force. And to go back to your Iran example in 1953, that's often seen as a success in literature, but it wasn't taking place in isolation. There were a whole load of diplomatic negotiations, oil sanctions, all sorts of stuff were going on at the same time. But when we talk about the coup and the regime change, we just talk about the CIA and MI6. But it complemented a much wider, open diplomatic and economic strategy. So my advice would be, think carefully about how any discreet or covert operation complements and works hand in hand with diplomacy, economic sanctions, whatever the levers of statecraft that we have. But that said, I do think there is a place for this sort of thing in Western states in the 21st century.
So one country that would probably not heed your advice or follow your advice, or it doesn't seem like it would be doing that, is Russia, because Russia is probably conducting more covert action right now, or at least it seems like it from the media, than almost anyone else. So I'd like to talk about Russia for Russia next. And I think that we've heard quite a lot about it. We've heard, the various European intelligence representatives have came out and spoke about it, about how extensive the Russian covert actions in Europe are. I think that the chief of MI6 said something similar, or said something along the lines of that the Russians have went feral with covert action in Europe, suggesting that it's pretty wild. To what extent, if you look at how the Soviets were doing that during the Cold War, to what extent is what we're seeing now really unprecedented? And how, as someone who is studying this and who's an expert on this, how are you seeing what Russians are doing now? Thank you for listening to the free part of this interview. The conversation is not over yet, but the next part is only for the paid members on my Patreon or Substack. I try to make the best possible geopolitics content, and I put a lot of effort and time into this podcast. And there's quite a lot of costs that I have to pay that are associated with it. It's the supporters on Patreon that allow me to do all that, and making part of every single interview exclusively available only for them is my way of saying thank you, since without them, it just wouldn't exist. So if you want to listen to the rest of the interview, ask questions to guests who appear on the show, or myself, get bonus content and my own takes on geopolitics, become part of an active community of geopolitics enthusiasts, and most importantly, make the continued existence of this podcast possible, do consider becoming a supporter. It really helps. To join, you can find the link in the description or go to patreon.com/decodinggeopolitics.